January 25, 1981. Adele Astaire, once the genius of Broadway, the star whose name blazed larger than Fred's across Times Square, died a ghost in Phoenix, remembered in obituaries only as Fred Astaire's sister. At 84, the woman critics had called the real talent of the partnership took her final breath surrounded by shadows rather than spotlights, her death barely noticed by a world that had long forgotten she once commanded its grandest stages. The nurses tending to her had no idea they were caring for the woman who had taught Fred to dance, who had been so luminous that he was known simply as Adele's brother during their glory years together. "Sometimes the bravest act is to disappear," she had once written. And in choosing to vanish from the stage at the height of her powers, Adele Astaire had performed her most radical act. Not a graceful exit, but an erasure so complete that even history forgot she had been the sun around which her brother's talent first orbited. The morning newspapers would run brief obituaries noting that Fred Astaire's sister had passed away, a footnote to his legendary career. Few mentioned that there had been a time when the equation was reversed, when Fred was the footnote and Adele was the headline, when Broadway marquees read Fred and Adele with her name in larger letters, when critics raved about her charm and vivacity while barely mentioning the shy young man who danced beside her. "Sometimes the bravest act is to disappear," she had once written to a friend. And in choosing to vanish from the stage at the height of her powers, Adele Astaire had performed her most radical act. Not a graceful exit, but an erasure so complete that even history seemed to forget she had once been the sun, around which her brother's talent had orbited. The irony was almost unbearably poignant. Fred Astaire would become one of the most celebrated dancers in cinema history. His name synonymous with elegance and grace, and while Adele, who had been the more naturally gifted performer, the one with the stage presence that could electrify an audience, the sister who had carried them both to stardom, would fade into a silence so profound that most people never knew she had existed at all. What if the real tragedy wasn't that she had been forgotten, but that she had chosen to be forgotten? What if walking away from the lights had been not an act of love or duty, but a form of self-erasure so complete that she had erased herself even from her own story? What if the woman who had once commanded Broadway's grandest stages had spent the rest of her life wondering whether anyone would remember she had been there at all? But to understand how Adele Astaire became Broadway's most luminous star and then its most deliberate ghost, we must first understand the beginning, when two children from Omaha, Nebraska, discovered that dancing together could transform them from ordinary into extraordinary, never knowing that their partnership would eventually require one of them to sacrifice everything for the other to become legendary. The year was 1896. And in Omaha, Nebraska, a baby girl was born into a family where dreams were currency, and talent was the only path out of ordinary circumstances. Adele Marie Austerlitz entered the world 18 months before her brother Fred, arriving into a household where their mother Anne had already decided that her children would not live the kind of struggling, uncertain life that she had endured. They would be performers, they would be famous, and they would rescue the family from the perpetual financial insecurity that had defined Anne's own childhood. From the very beginning, Adele possessed something that couldn't be taught or manufactured, a spark of natural charisma that made people want to watch her even when she was simply walking across a room. While other children her age were learning to read and write, Adele was being drilled in tap steps and ballet positions by their mother, who recognized in her daughter's uninhibited joy of movement the raw material for something extraordinary. Young Fred, when he arrived, seemed almost an afterthought in Anne's grand plan. He was shy, serious, and initially clumsy in ways that his older sister never was. But Anne understood something crucial about show business. Audiences loved sibling acts, and a brother-sister dance team would have novelty value that could open doors. So Fred was conscripted into Adele's education, learning to dance not because he particularly wanted to, but because his sister needed a partner. The dynamic between them was established early and would persist throughout their professional lives. Adele was the natural performer, blessed with an effortless stage presence and an ability to connect with audiences that seemed almost magical. She could make the most complex routines look like spontaneous play, could recover from mistakes with a laugh and a wink that made audiences love her even more. Fred, by contrast, had to work for every moment of grace, studying steps with an obsessive intensity that would later make him legendary, but in childhood simply made him seem like the less talented sibling. Could these early patterns, Adele as the star, Fred as the supporting player, have planted seeds for both her later success and her eventual self-erasure? Even as a child, she seemed to understand that being the center of attention was both her natural right and somehow a burden. That carrying the weight of the family's hopes meant that her own desires would always be secondary to their collective success. The Austerlitz family transformed themselves into the Astaires when they moved to New York, understanding that success in American vaudeville required a name that sounded sophisticated rather than immigrant. Anne became their manager, booking them into increasingly prestigious venues as Fred and Adele Astaire. Though everyone who saw them perform understood immediately that Adele was the real draw. By the time she was a teenager, Adele Astaire had already developed the qualities that would make her a Broadway sensation. She had a gift for comedy that went beyond mere timing. She could find the humor in any situation, could improvise dialogue that was often funnier than what the writers had provided, and could make audiences feel like they were sharing a private joke with her rather than watching a performance. Her dancing, while perhaps not as technically perfect as Fred's would eventually become, had a joyous quality that made people smile just watching her move. But there were also early signs of the conflict that would eventually tear her away from the stage. Adele was discovering that being a performer meant living in a kind of permanent childhood, forever playing roles written by others, forever meeting other people's expectations. The spontaneous, fun-loving girl who had taken naturally to performing was slowly recognizing that success meant repeating the same steps, the same jokes, the same smile night after night, year after year. The question that would haunt her entire career was already forming. Who was Adele Austerlitz when she wasn't being Adele Astaire? And if being loved by thousands meant giving up any chance at a private life, at genuine relationships, at choices that were her own rather than what the show required, was stardom worth the price? The 1920s arrived in New York like a champagne celebration, and Fred and Adele Astaire found themselves perfectly positioned to embody the era's spirit of liberation and joy. Broadway was entering its golden age, and the Astaire siblings were ascending to the very peak of theatrical stardom with a string of hit shows that made them the most sought-after performers on the Great White Way. The transformation was meteoric and total. For goodness sake, in 1922, Lady Be Good. In 1924, Funny Face. In 1927, each show more successful than the last, each one cementing their reputation as Broadway's most electrifying dance team. But those who worked with them understood the real dynamic. Adele was the sun, and Fred was learning to reflect her light. Critics were unanimous in their assessment of the partnership's hierarchy. The New York Times wrote that Adele Astaire is a sheer delight, spontaneous, vivacious, and irresistibly charming. Her brother provides capable support. Variety declared that Miss Astaire has that indefinable quality that makes stars. She doesn't just perform, she illuminates. Even George Gershwin, who wrote several of their biggest hits, confided to friends that he composed with Adele's personality in mind, knowing that Fred would simply have to keep up. The stage was where Adele came most alive, where her natural gifts found their fullest expression. She had an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences, making each person in the theater feel like she was performing just for them. Her comedy timing was impeccable. Her dancing was joyous rather than merely technical, and she possessed a warmth that made everyone who watched her feel somehow better about the world. But the success came with pressures that few outside the partnership could understand. The show had to go on 8 times a week, regardless of illness, exhaustion, or personal crisis. Every performance had to match the energy and precision of the one before. Every public appearance had to reinforce the image of the carefree, eternally cheerful Adele Astaire. The spontaneous girl who had loved dancing was becoming imprisoned by the very success she had achieved. More troubling was the way that fame was reshaping her relationship with Fred. In childhood, she had been the confident older sister guiding her shy younger brother. But as Fred's technical skills improved and his own artistry began to emerge, the dynamic was becoming more complex. He was still in her shadow professionally, but he was also becoming increasingly essential to her success in ways that made their partnership feel less like collaboration and more like mutual dependence. The question that began to haunt Adele during this period was whether she would spend her entire life being half of Fred and Adele, never knowing who Adele alone might have become. The partnership that had brought them both to stardom was also preventing either of them from discovering their individual potential. But walking away would mean destroying not just her own career but Fred's as well, and the weight of that responsibility was becoming harder to bear with each passing show. Behind all that success, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question was becoming increasingly relevant as Adele navigated the strange terrain of being famous for being herself, while simultaneously feeling like she had no self apart from her stage persona. She was beloved by thousands but known by almost no one, surrounded by admirers but isolated in ways that grew more profound with each standing ovation. The relationship with Lord Charles Cavendish began in 1928, when the Astaires took their show Funny Face to London's West End. Charles was everything that Broadway was not: aristocratic, reserved, rooted in centuries of tradition rather than the ephemeral world of show business. He represented escape from the endless repetition of performance, the possibility of a life where she could be simply a woman rather than always a performer. But accepting Charles would mean walking away from the stage, from Fred, from everything she had built over nearly 3 decades of performing. It would mean choosing between the identity she had created and the person she might still become. The decision that awaited her was one that would define not just her future but Fred's as well. And the weight of that choice was becoming impossible to ignore. The dilemma she faced was uniquely painful: stay on stage and remain forever Fred and Adele, or walk away and risk being forgotten entirely. Either choice meant a kind of erasure. Continuing would erase her individual self, leaving would erase her from the story she had helped create. But there was a third possibility that haunted her dreams during those final months before her decision. She would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, having dreamed of a future where she danced alone. Not with Fred, but as herself, Adele Astaire in her own right. In these dreams she was radiant, free, uncompromising. But when morning came and she looked at Fred over breakfast, saw the way his confidence had grown through their partnership, understood how completely his identity was woven with hers, she knew that her solo dreams would mean his destruction. The mathematics of fame were cruel and simple. One Astaire could become legendary, but 2 would always be compared, measured, found wanting in relation to each other. For Fred to become Fred Astaire, the icon, the innovator, the immortal, Adele Astaire would have to cease to exist. Love for her brother wasn't what drove her decision. It was something more complex and more painful: the recognition that talent alone wasn't enough, that film technology would preserve one dancer for eternity while stage performances would fade like morning mist, and that the world had room for only one Astaire legend. In the end, she would choose the latter, never fully understanding that in trying to find herself by leaving the lights, she would lose herself even more completely. The year 1932 marked the end of an era and the beginning of an erasure. After nearly 3 decades of partnership, after 17 Broadway shows and countless performances that had made them the most celebrated dance team in American theater, Adele Astaire walked away from the stage to marry Lord Charles Cavendish and become Lady Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire. The announcement sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. She was leaving at the absolute peak of her powers, abandoning a career that could have continued for years, choosing obscurity over immortality. The final performance of The Bandwagon on February 20th, 1932, was unlike any Broadway had ever witnessed. The theater was packed with everyone who mattered in New York society and show business, all understanding they were watching something that would never happen again. As Adele and Fred danced together for the last time professionally, the audience wasn't just watching a performance. They were witnessing a kind of death. In the wings after the final curtain call, as applause thundered through the theater, Adele slowly removed her dancing shoes. She held them for a moment, feeling the worn leather that had carried her through thousands of performances, then carefully placed them in a box and closed the lid, sealing away not just the shoes but the woman who had worn them. Fred watched in silence as his sister performed her final act. The deliberate burial of Adele Astaire, Broadway star. "Sometimes the bravest act is to disappear," she said to him. And in that moment, both of them understood she wasn't just leaving the stage. She was erasing herself from their story. "Fred will dance forever. I only danced for a while," she said to him that night. And in those words lay both her gift to him and her curse to herself. By leaving, she was giving him the freedom to become the legend he was destined to be. But she was also condemning herself to be remembered only as the sister who gave up, the talent who quit, the star who chose darkness over light. What she couldn't have known in 1932 was how technology would reshape memory itself. Within a few years, Fred would begin making films, permanent records of his genius that would allow millions who never saw him live to fall in love with his dancing. Each frame of celluloid was a kind of immortality, preserving his movements for generations yet unborn. But Adele's brilliance existed only in the fading recollections of those who had been fortunate enough to witness it firsthand. In yellowing reviews that fewer people read with each passing year, in the dimming memories of aging theatergoers who would eventually take her legacy to their graves. The cruelest irony of all was that film, the medium that would make Fred immortal, had been available during their partnership years. There were moments, brief windows, brief when they might have been captured together on screen, when posterity might have been able to judge for itself which Astaire had been the greater artist. But those opportunities had passed, and now Fred would dance alone for the cameras, his solo performances the only record that future generations would ever know. She had saved Fred from being merely the brother of a legend, but in doing so, she had condemned herself to being merely the sister of one. The marriage to Charles Cavendish brought her to the cold stone halls of British aristocracy, where Broadway seemed like a fever dream from another life. In a drafty corridor of Cavendish Estate one winter afternoon in 1934, Adele sat alone listening to a crackling radio broadcast from America. Fred's voice came through the static, being interviewed about his new film career, his solo success, his bright future. She sat perfectly still in the shadows of the ancient corridor, her face illuminated only by weak afternoon light filtering through leaded windows. The woman who had once commanded Broadway's brightest stages was now a silent listener in the dark, hearing her brother's voice travel across an ocean to reach her. The irony was unbearable. She had disappeared so Fred could shine, and now his light reached her only as an echo, a ghost of the partnership she had willingly destroyed. Sometimes the bravest act is to disappear, she had told herself. But sitting in that cold corridor, she began to wonder if bravery and self-destruction were the same thing. The loneliness she had felt during her performing years intensified in ways she hadn't anticipated. At least on stage, the applause had provided a form of connection, however artificial. In the cold corridors of British estates, there was only silence and the growing realization that she had traded one form of imprisonment for another. She had been performing all her life, and now she was performing being a duchess. But this role came without applause, without affirmation, without any evidence that her performance mattered to anyone. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? For Adele, walking away from Broadway wasn't a downfall, but a kind of suicide, the deliberate killing of the self she had spent her entire life creating. Every day in England was a reminder of what she had given up. Every mention of Fred's continuing success was a confirmation that she had made herself irrelevant to the story they had written together. The personal tragedies that followed seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. Her marriage to Charles, while genuine in its affection, never quite filled the void that performing had left. When Charles died young, leaving her a widow, she tried to return to the stage briefly but discovered that audiences no longer wanted the Adele Astaire they remembered. They wanted the memory to stay perfect, frozen in time. Her attempts at comeback felt like watching a ghost try to become solid again, and the embarrassment of it drove her back into obscurity. Back in America, Fred's career was ascending to heights that made their Broadway success seem almost quaint by comparison. He was becoming immortal through film, his dancing preserved forever in movies that would be watched by generations who would never know that he had once been Adele's brother. Each of his triumphs was simultaneously a validation of her sacrifice and a confirmation of her erasure. She had given him the world by leaving it, and the world had responded by forgetting she had ever been there. The letters between them during these years reveal a complicated dance of love and loss, of pride and pain. Fred would write about his latest film, his new dance partners, his growing fame, always ending with some variation of, "I wish you could have been part of this." But they both knew the truth. She could never have been part of his film career precisely because she had been part of his stage career. Hollywood wanted Fred Astaire, singular sensation, not Fred and Adele, the vaudeville siblings who had conquered Broadway. There were moments when she almost returned. In 1937, widowed and alone, she accepted a few film offers, thinking perhaps she could reclaim some fragment of what she had given up. But watching herself on screen was like seeing a ghost, technically proficient, but missing the spark that had made her transcendent. The camera, which loved Fred's precision and control, was indifferent to her spontaneity and warmth. What had made her magical on stage, the ability to make every audience member feel personally connected to her, was precisely what didn't translate to celluloid. She was learning that some forms of genius can only exist in the moment, in the exchange between performer and audience, and that preservation through technology isn't the same as immortality. Fred will dance for both of us. "I only hope people remember I was once there," she wrote to a friend during this period. And the pathos of that hope, not that people would remember her greatness, but simply that they would remember her existence, revealed the full tragedy of her choice. She had been not just forgotten but erased, written out of a story she had been central to creating. The question that haunted her later years was whether she had made the right choice, and the answer seemed to change depending on which loss she was mourning most. The career she had abandoned, the marriage that had failed to compensate for that loss, or the self she had given up in service of both. She had thought she was choosing love over fame, but what she had actually chosen was invisibility over existence. The final decades of Adele Astaire's life unfolded in a silence that was both chosen and imposed, a kind of living erasure where she existed in the margins of a story that had once revolved around her. She moved between New York and Arizona, maintaining friendships from her Broadway days, but increasingly becoming a relic of an era that seemed impossibly distant, a ghost from a glamorous past that most people under 50 had never witnessed. The relationship with Fred during these years was complicated by what had been lost and what remained. They maintained affection and connection, but there was always an unspoken acknowledgement between them of the sacrifice she had made and the career he had built on that foundation. When they met, which became increasingly rare as his fame grew and her relevance diminished, there was a kind of gentle sorrow in their interactions. Two people who had once moved in perfect synchronization now moving in completely different worlds. The letters she wrote during this period, many of which survived her, reveal a woman trying to make peace with choices that had seemed inevitable at the time, but increasingly felt like a form of self-destruction. The stage was my playground, but duty became my prison, she reflected, understanding finally that she had simply traded one cage for another, exchanging the demanding routine of performance for the stifling expectations of aristocratic life, and then for the even more profound imprisonment of being forgotten. The transformation of Fred into a legend made her erasure more complete with each passing year. Film scholars and dance historians would write extensively about Fred Astaire's genius, occasionally mentioning in passing that he had once performed with his sister, but rarely investigating what that partnership had actually meant or who had been the star when it began. Adele had become a footnote, a piece of historical trivia, the answer to a question nobody thought to ask. But perhaps the most painful aspect of her later years was watching younger generations discover Fred's films and fall in love with his dancing, without any awareness that his gifts had been honed through years of performing alongside someone whose natural talent had exceeded his own. She had not just been forgotten. She had been erased so completely that even the story of how Fred became Fred no longer included her in any meaningful way. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Adele, the question was whether she could ever escape from the absence of shadows, from the strange half-existence of being simultaneously a legend to those who remembered Broadway in the 1920s and a complete unknown to everyone else. She had chosen to disappear, but she hadn't understood that disappearing would mean haunting the edges of her own story. Present but invisible, remembered but forgotten. In her Arizona years, she would sit alone in her modest home, reading yet another magazine article celebrating Fred as the greatest dancer who ever lived. Her hands would tremble slightly as she turned the pages, not from age, but from the strange sensation of reading your own erasure. Each tribute to Fred's genius was simultaneously true and incomplete, praising the legend while forgetting the woman who had created him. She kept a scrapbook of these articles, a private archive of her own disappearance. Occasionally she would add a marginal note. He learned that from watching me, or I taught him that step in 1915. These whispered corrections to history would never be heard, filed away in a house where no one visited, maintained by a woman who had chosen invisibility and was learning to live with its consequences. Sometimes the bravest act is to disappear, she had once said, but in her final years she seemed less certain that her disappearance had been brave rather than simply sad. She had thought she was choosing authenticity over artifice, real life over performance. But what she had actually chosen was invisibility over existence. The woman who had once lit up Broadway's biggest stages had spent the majority of her life in darkness, not because the lights had dimmed, but because she had walked away from them. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? Perhaps they were neither, simply the consequences of a choice made at 28 that had seemed romantic and noble, but had slowly revealed itself to be a form of self-erasure so complete that even she struggled to remember who Adele Austerlitz had been before she became Adele Astaire, and who Adele Astaire had been before she chose to become nobody at all. When Adele Astaire died in January 1981, the obituaries were brief and largely focused on her relationship to Fred rather than her own achievements. The New York Times ran a short piece noting that Fred Astaire's sister, with whom he had once performed on Broadway, had passed away. There were no retrospectives of her career, no celebrations of the joy she had brought to audiences, no acknowledgement that she had once been the star while he was still learning to shine. The funeral was small and private, attended by Fred and a handful of friends who still remembered the radiant young woman who had once commanded Broadway's grandest stages. Standing at her grave, Fred wept not just for his sister but for the partnership they had shared, for the sacrifice she had made, and perhaps for the awareness that his own legendary status had been built partly on her erasure. He had brought with him the box containing her final pair of dancing shoes, the ones she had carefully put away after that last performance in 1932. For 49 years they had remained sealed, a time capsule of the moment when Adele Astaire chose to become nobody. Now, as workers prepared to lower her casket, Fred opened the box one last time. The shoes were still there, the leather worn and shaped by thousands of performances, the soles thin from dancing on Broadway's greatest stages. "You were always the star, Deli," he whispered, using the childhood nickname only he was allowed to speak. "I just learned to dance in your light." It was the truest thing he would ever say about their partnership, but he would never repeat it publicly. The legend of Fred Astaire, self-made, singular, incomparable, couldn't accommodate the truth that he had been crafted in someone else's image, that his genius had been learned rather than innate, that the greatest dancer of the 20th century had started as the kid brother trying to keep up with his impossibly talented sister. Fred placed the shoes gently into the grave alongside Adele's casket, reuniting the dancer with the evidence of her dancing, even if history would never reunite her name with her achievements. In the weeks following her death, a few longer pieces appeared in theater journals and entertainment magazines, attempting belatedly to restore Adele to her proper place in Broadway history. These articles reminded readers that during the 1920s, Adele Astaire had been the bigger star, that critics had consistently praised her naturalness and charm above Fred's technical precision, that she had been the one audiences came to see. But these attempts at historical correction felt inadequate, almost insulting in their tardiness. They were trying to resurrect a reputation that had been buried not by failure or scandal but by choice and time, attempting to restore visibility to someone who had actively chosen to disappear. The tragedy was that Adele herself might not have welcomed the attention. She had spent 50 years learning to live without applause, and posthumous acclaim was perhaps the cruelest form of recognition. The true measure of her erasure became clear in the years that followed, as each new generation discovered Fred Astaire's films and fell in love with his dancing. Film retrospectives, dance documentaries, and Hollywood histories would mention his Broadway background. But Adele rarely merited more than a passing reference. She had become what she had perhaps feared most, not a villain or a failure, but simply irrelevant to the story that mattered. The letters and personal papers that survived her revealed the full scope of her internal struggle with this invisibility. "Fred will dance forever. I only danced for a while," she had written, and in that acceptance lay both dignity and devastation. She had recognized early that their joint fame could not last forever, that one of them would have to step aside for the other to become legendary. In choosing to be the one who disappeared, she had given Fred his destiny but lost her own, The mystery surrounding Adele Astaire is not one of hidden scandals or secret tragedies, but something more profound. The enigma of how someone so talented, so celebrated, so essential to an art form's development could be so completely forgotten. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about whose contributions get remembered and whose get erased, about the price that women have historically paid for choosing love or duty over career, about how easily even the brightest stars can be dimmed by time and choice. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Adele's case, the powerful forces were perfectly visible. The expectations of gender, the demands of aristocratic society, the economics of show business that made solo stars more valuable than partnerships, and the simple fact that film preserved Fred's dancing for eternity, while Adele's brilliance existed only in the fading memories of those who had been fortunate enough to witness it live. Adele Astaire died as she had lived for 50 years, in the shadows, having made the extraordinary choice to walk away from light when it was still burning brightest. She had danced Fred into immortality, and in doing so, erased herself. Her sacrifice was complete, her disappearance nearly total. History would remember Fred Astaire as one of the greatest dancers who ever lived, while barely noting that he learned his craft in partnership with someone whose natural gifts had exceeded his own. Adele Astaire proved that sometimes the bravest curtain call is to vanish, but history rarely forgives those who disappear. And perhaps that's the question we should all ask ourselves. How many brilliant women have chosen love, chosen duty, chosen to step aside, and been written out of their own stories? When we celebrate Fred's legend, are we complicit in erasing the woman who taught him to shine? Adele showed us that disappearing can be an act of generosity, but she also showed us that the world rarely remembers the generous, only the visible. The question is, will we learn to look for the missing names, the erased footprints, the stars who sacrificed their light so others could burn brighter?